The dark side of Worcester, dreadful dens in Dalday, how the poor live and die in them. Slumming has gone out of fashion. It is no longer a fashionable pursuit to drive your broom into the haunts of starvation, and picking up your silken skirts in your dainty gloved hand to inspect poverty, squalor and dirt with your nose glued to a scent bottle and your lips framing syllables of polite surprise. At about this time, a penny leaflet called The Bitter Cry roused the West End of London to take an interest in the East End for a time. But the motion was a spasm as ephemeral as a flash of sunshine on a winter's day. The death of Harriet Cook in the Dalday Den last week has roused the well-to-do people of Worcester to shudder and rub their eyes, wonder if such things really are. Will the shudder and the wonder cease? Will cold, impassive responsibility drown the still, small voice of indignation? Or has the public got a conscience or a heart to be quickened into active life? The slums of Worcester are in a small compass, writes our representative, who's been instructed not to exaggerate the facts and upon whose competency and trustworthiness our readers may place every reliance. But to explore them properly would take more than one day. I spent in them only 3 short hours and yet saw more horrible squalor and filth, more hopelessness and hideous poverty, more shameful and disgraceful brutishness than even I expected, and my expectation was not small. I saw houses which I would not put a dog in, and yet they shelter human beings who call them home. I saw filth unnameable, amidst which unheeding and unmindful men and women and children lived and ate and slept. I saw poverty so terrible that I was powerless to do aught but wonder. It seemed too great for endurance. Brazen shame and unblushing immorality on every side. Soliciting. Susan Sylvester, 21, unfortunate, 11 Court, Dalday, was charged with soliciting prostitution in Shaw Street on Sunday. Defendant solicited a policeman in plain clothes. She offered to leave the town if the bench would let her off. The chief constable complained of the annoyance such women caused in Shaw Street and the Foregate. Could not but feel glad that I had no part in the terrible responsibility which must attach to the ownership of these human cesspools. To the chief constable of the city I owe the opportunity I had of seeing horrible Worcester face to face. And the story that I'm going to tell is no sensational claptrap. It is true, every word of it, terribly, scandalously true. It was 7 o'clock in the evening when I started on my task. I was guided, and I may say also guarded, by Inspector Wallace, an officer who has done the city good service in his time, and who knows every corner of the rookeries we visited. We went into lodging houses, into what are known as furnished rooms, and into self-contained dwellings tenanted only by the dead, and into rooms where these lay who would soon be as silent and cold as the great majority. First of all, let me tell you what I saw in the lodging houses, that I may reach my horror step by step, and not thrust them before you without preparation. For the lodging houses, the havens of the tramp and the brightest spots in the slums, that is not saying much either for the slums or the lodging houses, but in choosing evils, it seems to me that the lodging houses are the least. In a comparative sense, they are clean. And why? Because they are subject to inspection. There is nothing so plentiful in a lodging house as whitewash, and whitewash hides a multiple of sins. The break in the whitewash monotony is in the kitchen. In the first lodging house I entered, the kitchen was about the size of the same apartment in an ordinary artisan's dwelling. I counted 13 persons in that room, and among them were several Italian organ grinders. The travellers, as they are called, sat on benches around the fire. Some were smoking and spitting freely on the floor, others were having their supper. Of what the meal consisted I know not. The smell of it and the sight of it warned me to investigate the mystery no further. I would have little hesitation in affirming that for weeks none of these tramping folk had known the luxury of soap and water. In winter the weather is too cold for that, and a coat of dirt atones for the poverty of garments which let in the wind and the frost too freely. There they sat while the heat of the room played upon the mass of them, and evolved a stench so fetid and so appalling that I rejoiced in my ability to smoke strong tobacco. One kitchen is very much the same as another. There are 7 lodging houses in Dalday, and all are much alike. Before one great fire sat a man toasting a haddock on a fork. When we came downstairs, he had laid it on one hand, tearing it in shreds and conveying it to his mouth. He washed the fish down with draughts of a weak decoction of tea stalks and sugar, brewed as it was served in a cracked bowl. In another kitchen I saw a man whose looks suggested to me that he was not always a traveller and a vagabond. A shred of newspaper was on the table before him. On that newspaper lay a pickled herring. Beside it was a crust of bread. His fingers were his knife and fork, and he ate as he doubtless lived, mechanically, hopelessly, without enjoyment. In yet another I saw a man whom I have often met in the streets of Worcester before, a helpless imbecile. He too was making his supper, and what do you think it was? Crusts, dry, hard lumps of bread, handed to him at the rich man's back door, it may be, by a compassionate domestic, and stony fragments which he had picked up in the street, and which even the dogs had neglected. These were his supper. He was soaking them in a tin of hot water and ladling them into his mouth with his dirty fingers, and as he ate, the group around the fire made ribald jests about his visible growth under this fattening diet, and the accumulation of flesh which was hourly going on. Women and men and children all sat together in these dens before the fires, and the amusements of the evening were loose conversation, still looser tales, and maybe the reading of bits from a stray newspaper. Upstairs it was quieter, but little less attractive. Everywhere the whitewash, and nearly everywhere the sickly smell which arises from bad ventilation. The stairs were often rickety, generally of the most breakneck steepness, and the lowness of the roofs made me bear away more whitewash than I wanted. The beds were all close together, and I counted as many as 5 in one place, barely big enough, in my opinion, for 3. Still, I suppose the law is complied with. 9 persons in that place when the house is full, and in one garret scarcely large enough, as it seemed to me, for a solitary sleeper. 5 persons go in 3 beds to what they call rest. It is much the same in them all, and the price for these beds range from 3 and 4 for single sleepers to 6 and 8 for a double bed. How decent and decorous the system is may be judged from one fact. There are no isolated rooms for married people, but several married couples will bundle into adjoining beds. But let us leave the lodging houses and go to the furnished rooms. For the lodging houses are only part of what I went to see. The difference between these places and the lodging house is this, that the latter is licensed to take in lodgers by the night, and the rooms are let to weekly tenants. These tenants, in the great majority of cases, are women who live by their immorality, and in the remainder there are families of 4 or 5 people who live and move and have their being, such as it is, in one close room. These apartments are let by the keepers of the lodging houses, who know that they will, in 6 cases out of every 10, be used as brothels. As many as 10 families sometimes will inhabit a house, living by 3s and 4s and 5s in a room. Some of the children are all nearly grown up, yet father and mother, sister and brother huddle together there night and day and call it living. Some of them try to make their rooms bright with coloured almanacs and gay advertisements, if nothing more artistic is available. And such rooms, the best of them, are close, ill ventilated and often dirty, and the worst of them beggar description. It is with the worst of them and the worst of their denizens that I have to deal primarily, though it seems to me that good or bad in warrens like this are terms which, 10 yards off in busy, prosperous Broad Street, would resolve themselves into one stern, unutterable bad. But dealing with the worst of that, which is all bad in itself, let us first go to the house where Harriet Cook died one night last week. As a prelude, let us read again Dr. Strange's description of the place. I found the house one of the best in the street, clean inside and outside, with a well-paved and clean passage and yard. The house consists of 3 good-sized rooms. The paper, the walls and the ceiling of all the rooms are in good repair and fairly clean. Cook let off the 2 lower rooms and lived with his family in the garret, a large and well-ventilated room. There's absolutely no furniture in any of the rooms, nothing but a heap of rags in one corner of the garret where the family slept. Some portion of the flooring had been torn up, apparently for firewood. We got the keys and entered this house, which is certainly one of the best in the street, and which Dr. Strange says would let for 5 or 6 shillings a week in another situation. The news that something was afoot had brought a little crowd around the door, and out of it came Mary Henry and the other woman, her name I am sorry I do not know, for it's worth publishing, who helped to perform the last office for the deceased. In the lower room the dead woman was lay in her coffin, and never in her life perhaps had she looked so decent, and she was enveloped in a long white woolen shroud edged with black. There was a black cross on the breast and a flower at the neck. A corner of the shroud was lifted, and I saw that the body was robed in clean white underlinen. A touching story was to unfold. Whence do you think these things came? The two women, absolute strangers to the dead, had bought them out of their own money so that the body might be decently interred. And what is more, they'd paid 7 and 6 out of their pockets towards a grave space for no reason on earth than that they had kind hearts and felt compassion for the poor wretch who died such a death. For weeks they had fed her children, and they are feeding them now. And though these women may be bad and degraded from the self-satisfied, respectable point of view, I for one respect them for what they have done quite as highly as I respect benevolence in higher walks of life. This is a touching and pathetic instance of the kindness which the very poor feel one towards another, and how ready they are to share a crust or a copper. Harriet Cook was buried yesterday, and the girl Henry and her friend attended the funeral. After much careful clambering, we reached the garret, a large room enough, with several holes in the floor. The forward theory is pure conjecture, and plenty of ventilation from a skylight and a window. The floor was covered with unmentionable filth. In the corner stood a bucket of foulness, emitting a horrible stench, and in another lay a loathsome heap of rags, chaff and hops, on which for 3 months the woman and her 3 children had huddled together and slept. Filthy living and filthy dying indeed, and yet it is no one's business to make the filth less filthy and the squalid lives more cleanly. Nearly opposite the house is a court. In going up the dark, dismal passage, I stumbled over holes and pitfalls, and in going up the stairs, I feared constantly that I would fall headlong. Yet in this place there are dozens of inhabited rooms which every decent man, however poor, would regard as unfit for his own habitation. So tumble down is the place that some parts of the building have actually given away and long been in disuse, and the others will by and by follow in their wake. The quicker the process of decay is, the better. For each of these rooms, the occupants have to pay rents of 3 and 4 shillings a week. Hans Court is a still more repulsive locality. It runs from Dalday into Newport Street, and the state of the houses appalled me. In one of them 3 people sat, a dirty man, a dirtier child, and the dirtiest, most repelling woman I met in the whole evening. 2 broken-back chairs and a tottering table were the only furniture in the room, and by the light of a sputtering candle stuck in a bottle, the woman was mending a basket in which perhaps today she is carrying watercress to be sold. The walls were black with grime. There was a bucket of filthy water on the floor, and 2 or 3 dirty plates were laid close by, apparently waiting to be washed in the vile puddle. In one place the ceiling was giving way and bulged in alarmingly. The woman was garrulous and told us that the inspector had been there 3 weeks before, that he said something ought to be done, that nothing had yet been done, and she supposed it was owing to the weather. She took a light and showed us upstairs. There were 2 rooms, practically one, divided by a partition. Here 4 people slept, and 3 we saw, and a boy. The man and woman lay on a bed about a yard wide, on which the only bedclothes were 2 pieces of what seemed to me to be sacks. In the corner was a heap of sacks rolled up, and there the girl slept. On the other side of the partition, with the wind whistling in, was a bed of the same description for the boy. How foul was the den I cannot describe. Its rent was 1 11 a week. Next door but one was a man and his family, an intelligent fellow he seemed, and willing enough to speak. They paid 3 shillings for the house, which was not nearly so dirty, but quite as decrepit as the others. Something should be done, but whatever that something was, it had not been done yet. In the adjoining house there was the same tale to tell, and it was always told with the same absence of surprise that these things should be, and the same hopelessness of anything brighter or better or cleaner or more healthy. Just a yard or 2 further down the court, the houses had begun to anticipate the inspector, and to tumble into wreck and ruin of their own accord. Out of Dalday into Quay Street we went. Nearly at the foot of it stood a big house, once I believe an inn. We knocked at a door and entered. The fire and the lamp had been smoking together, and it was not at first an easy matter to discern the 3 persons sat around the fire, comfortably, as it seemed, inhaling a fearful combination of odours. A table, 2 seats and a cupboard furnished the room, which was lofty enough, but woefully dirty. 2 of the 3 inmates were old women. The 3rd was a man, the son of one of them, and there they lived in a state of great filth. Their faces and their hands and clothes were grimed with dirt, and a vermin-infested heap of sacks was all that the 2 women slept on. Across the passage was another room where the son said he slept. It appeared to contain only a basket, but when I asked him where his bed was, he showed me a sack stuffed with shavings. "Where," said I, "are your bedclothes?" All he showed me was another sack. Imagine, as you go to sleep on feather beds, beneath warm quilts, the plight of this miserable object, who throws his dirty body on a dirty bag full of shavings, covers himself with a dirty sack and calls it bed. "Do you ever," I said, "see a parson here?" They laughed. "Not likely," was all the old woman said, "and I do not wonder that the clergyman does not go. What is the use of dinning the gospel into the ears of people who live in a state of disease-breeding squalor and spend their lives in the unceasing battle with starvation? When they are fed and clothed and housed as Christians ought to be, they will be in a mood to listen to such tidings. Now their instincts are as material and animal as those of cattle in the fields. In the other parts of the house there was less poverty and more cleanliness, but at the very top was a touching instance of sheer poverty. A man sat before a fire, putting a patch on a tremendous rent on a leg of his trousers, and he explained that he had got no other trousers to wear, so that he had either to patch them himself or go to bed while his wife did. And the wife, a pale-faced, pinched but respectable-looking woman, hovered about the wretchedly bare room as if ashamed of its poverty. This week I may perhaps be permitted to bring in 1 or 2 lighter relieving touches which have gradually worked themselves through the darkness of the impression produced by 3 hours among the warrens of the poor. It's curious that these rays of light should be entirely associated with child life. Some people have persuaded themselves that the children are invariably hateful in the slums, and that they're not like the nice, clean, pink-cheeked, well-dressed children who have pretty toys and nurses to wait on them. But the woes of these infants are far more touching than the troubles and trials of the well-fed, well-washed, well-clothed and well-housed children of the comfortable middle classes, for there is an element of security about the lives of the latter. There is little but darkness around those of the former. Perhaps they are right, there are no children in Dalday that I would have cared to take up and fondle in my arms. On the evening of last Christmas Day, a father and mother in Dalday went out to spend an hour or two with some friends and neighbours, leaving 2 of their children locked in their only room. The boys played with the fire, set the bedding in flames, and were suffocated. The sad affair was, as a matter of course, attributed to the drunkenness and dissoluteness of the parents, who preferred fuddling in a neighbour's house to discharging their domestic duties. But this proved to be untrue. The parents were decent people in their way. When I went through Dalday, I saw the father, who seemed to be depressed by the loss of his children, and he dwelt with something like pathos on the fact that the youngest child, which was left, was always calling on the others to come and play with him, for they used to be fond of one another. There is something like fondness and affection, even amid the dirt of Dalday, you see. But I should say that history and experience point to the inutility of trying to reform those who are grounded in this kind of life. They must die out, as the weakly and incapable in all countries die out, as the savage dies out before the advancing civilization. The young should be captured and civilized and taught the means of gaining their livelihood, and so of climbing up into the region of the artisan and the regular labourer. Whilst the old are dying out, is the time for charity and sympathy and pity to step in to remove the pangs of hunger and to smooth the pillow of the sick, the miserable and the dying. The rector of All Saints told me a very interesting story of an old man in his parish who had taken a very deep interest in the restoration of the church. He's a very poor man living in a poor house in Dalday, and every quarter he gives the rector 5 shillings for the fund and to pay the cost of the work. He does not go much to church, but he believes in the scheme which has been carried out and gives his poor man's mite to help out. People have complained at the bad name given to Dalday last year by this paper, and they maintain that the people of Dalday were not so bad as they'd been described.